We will now switch to our next talk, and I hope that everybody who has comments and questions will hold them and participate in the discussion when we've heard from all of our speakers. Our next speaker is Dr. Quinn Grundy from the University of Toronto.
Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation over the last couple of days, and so thank you for the invitation. We've been asked today to discuss solutions after a couple of days that have illustrated so thoroughly kind of the evidence around sponsor influence on the quality of health research, the issues that arise. It's a bit of a daunting task, but I hope to suggest in this talk some of our current work looking at models that are in practice around both the conduct but dissemination of research where we might begin to move in that direction. I thought before my specific disclosures, I would just position myself for a moment. And so I wanted to first say that I am a social scientist doing mostly qualitative research. And in this way, I feel I'm wearing an ideas hat, and I'm going to advocate for a systems approach to this issue, and one that accounts for, say, the political economy of biopharmaceutical research. So this means understanding that across sectors, and we've seen this in the talks the last few days, that corporations share a set of practices which are incentivized and structured by both economic factors like shareholder returns and political factors like the regulatory environment. And I think we've seen in the talks on the chemical industry, pharmaceutical, the food industries, that regardless of the product, corporations have these similar practices because of these structures, particularly in the ways that they engage in sponsorship of and in conduct of scientific research. And so looking at these practices and the structures, I think, can really start to point to ways where we might imagine new conditions for this research ecosystem that we've been exploring. I'm also a registered nurse, and so I also feel like I wear a very applied real-world hat. And so some of the examples I'll give today are actually initiatives, and I think many of the workshop participants are actually involved in building solutions from the ground up. We've talked a lot about kind of top-down leadership, but I think there's also a lot of action that can be taken in the meantime. Sorry, let me see if I can change my slide. So my funding statement here, just acknowledge that most of the work I will discuss has been funded by the Canadian government, the Social Science Humanities Research Council, my tax program in partnership with Canadian Blood Services, and I am based at the University of Toronto, which has also provided support. I have no conflicts of interest. I will note that I was a project board member for the Cochrane Collaboration Conflict of Interest Policy, which I will mention. I'm also a current member of their arbitration panel, and so actively involved in the implementation, and as well as an editor for the New Journal. We've talked in the last few days really about the dominance of industry sponsors in a great deal of clinical research, particularly biopharmaceutical and device. I think Dr. Gross yesterday cited that more than 90% of oncology trials are industry sponsored. Dr. Schmidt talked about the historical contemporary conditions that have made the nutrition research field dominated by corporate sponsors. And we've heard that they are involved in a variety of ways, from provision of free study drug all the way through to conducting and publishing the results of the trial with an academic researcher in name only, so the practice of ghostwriting. And we have, I think, spent a great deal of time talking about the issues that arise in terms of biases, from the setting the research agenda to the publication of favorable results and conclusions. I selected this image for this slide. This was a study conducted by a group of authors, Atoll et al., several years ago, pulling trials registered in the WHO registry, and they categorized them both by country and World Bank income category. And I think what I take from this is that overall, only 30% of trials had an industry sponsor as the primary, which may actually underestimate industry involvement. But when you look at the distribution globally, sponsorship also, maybe we need to think about the health equity impacts of sponsorship bias. And I don't know that this has come up yet, and I'm going to bring a more global lens in this talk. So we look at the high income, upper middle income countries where over 2/3 of trials had industry sponsors, and in low income countries, just closer to 10%. The international collaborations also disproportionately involved industry sponsors. In the talks in the last few days, we also have a compelling, evocative picture of the web of relationships in addition to industry sponsorship of the research itself. I see author conflict of interest as distinct, though clearly related to industry sponsorship. And I think the key takeaway that I have from the last days is that we need to understand sponsorship in a social context. So this most obviously includes this backdrop web of relationships between trialists, researchers, and industry. And I think many other panels have clearly articulated and advocated for transparency around these relationships with the wonderful caveats that Dr. Sa, I think, has now provided. And so this is not to pick on this study or journal, but I think it so plainly illustrates the status quo in terms of how we're managing this. A trial that is both sponsored by and then illustrates the web of relationships the trialists have with both that company and a plethora of other companies. This model of dealing with this problem has been thoroughly critiqued. These disclosures are visible but not accessible or fit for purpose. It's difficult to understand the relevance. We've got the likelihood of it backfiring. However, I think in hearing perspectives from the chemical industry folks, the food industry folks, it's still important. And I think both Adam Dunn and Lisa Barrow, my collaborators in the past days, have talked about some of our work around disclosures. And we thought, after sifting through about 1,000 of these statements manually, that we had some insights in how we might improve these. And so I will say that in addition to kind of structured reporting to enable that meta-analyses, we need additional pieces to assess relevance. And by that, I mean transparency, I think, is most useful when it enables accountability. So when we think of other methodological biases, researchers need to account in their work for how those biases were mitigated, not so much for conflicts of interest or study funding. And so we've made some recommendations to improve disclosures in that respect. But we cannot lose sight of the downstream effects. And I think following on Dr. Redbird's talk, we are hearing more and more this notion of independence. And I offer this visual, which I love and use in my teaching, from Dr. Shimonis and colleagues in a recent scoping review, where they sought to map the range of medical product industry ties within the health system. They found that most of these activities are unregulated, opaque, and they have very real downstream and often harmful effects on patients and also stakeholders in the wider healthcare systems. This has really been the focus of most of my research in the sense of the day-to-day interactions between people on the ground and industry. And I think it's important to highlight the role of industry sponsorship really in research as the root cause of many of these dependencies. So clinicians frequently perceive industry or their representatives as the experts. They rely on industry sponsored, industry conducted, and industry curated research and information for clinical practice, some of them present in the settings where clinical care is provided. And I think particularly as a nurse and from a nursing perspective, it's not just surgical devices, but for a whole range of medical products, equipment, devices used in day-to-day care. Industry is increasingly the only source of information about those products. And they are taking on the role as educators, as an extension or in place of clinicians in terms of integrating that information into practice. So I think this ultimately underscores the need to develop research practices and policies that conceptualize, prioritize, ensure independence. And Dr. Sa, I think, discussed two of these with separation and blinding. And research integrity, I think this notion of a deep professionalism, these are social practices. So we also need to create spaces for training, for research, for dissemination, where independence is really held up. So I'm going to just first provide an example about one space in research evidence synthesis and dissemination, and then some ideas about how we might bring that in the conduct of research. So as I mentioned, I was involved with the development of the Cochrane collaboration, their revised policy. And I think this is an example of a policy lever by a trusted organization to begin kind of prying open a degree of separation or create a norm of separation between those sponsoring the research and those appraising, synthesizing, and disseminating that evidence in forms that are most useful to clinicians and the public. So I've taken this table from Dr. Barrow's BMJ blog when the policy came out, and just to highlight that the Cochrane Library as a key principle has independence, that review content should avoid conflicts of interest with commercial sponsorship and be produced by people without those conflicts. So currently the Cochrane database of systematic reviews is the only biomedical publication, to my knowledge, that actually prohibits funding of the review. The BMJ may be the only other example where they've prohibited tobacco industry funded research. And there are additional policy measures to begin kind of, again, creating that separation where it prohibits the majority of the team from having a conflict of interest, prohibits lead authors, senior authors from having direct conflicts of interest. So clearly not a complete solution, but I think an incremental, notable step in that direction. But this pertains to dissemination. And so how do we start figuring out how to create independence in actual conduct of research? So this is plasma. I'm going to shift gears for a minute. So the COVID pandemic, where we're sitting at the moment, I think has brought to light and really shone a spotlight on multiple forms of health inequities. And one of them, I think, most glaringly is in the access and distribution of diagnostic testing tools, antivirals, vaccines globally. And I think foreseeing this eventuality, many had strong critiques of the production of biopharmaceutical research at the outset, called for open science, called for reforms to intellectual property provisions, commitments to equitable access. And I don't think we've made it. And I think there's a strong sense that the status quo is not meeting our needs in terms of public health and public resources. As countries planned their pandemic response at the beginning of all this, convalescent plasma emerged as a promising drug. And so for the non-clinical audience, convalescent plasma is taken from people who were exposed to COVID. It was thought the antibodies might have a protective effect, a stopgap measure while we waited for vaccines and other treatments. There were two main approaches. So on the public sector side, usually working with blood services, hospitals, academic researchers, they were looking to collect plasma for direct transfusion. And then there was interest in developing a hyperimmune immunoglobulin, which was really spearheaded by the for-profit plasma industry. So my colleagues and I, some of who are with Canadian Blood Services, who were launching their own trial, we wanted to understand the social processes of clinical trial governance among this kind of natural experiment where there were really diverse players involved. And what has come out of this for us is really a story of what we might consider public sector drug development, public sector innovation in biopharmaceutical research. So we did an in-depth qualitative study sampling these 8 highly prominent and impactful clinical studies across 6 countries and analyzed over 240 documents that we found and were publicly available, a massive amount of information. We found that almost all the trials were nearly exclusively publicly funded or by non-governmental actors. There was one industry-led initiative to develop a hyperimmune immunoglobulin that partnered with the NIH, who then funded and conducted the trial. The drug was provided by industry. So I'm going to argue these studies actually offer rich insights into how we might reimagine the conduct of research, where the public sector takes a leading role. And qualitatively, it looked different. And so I'm going to kind of present some ideas for discussion about where we might find those levers in the practices and policies around independence. I think what came out at the front was that this was considered a most equitable drug. So from the get-go, as countries planned their pandemic responses, the research questions and convalescent plasma, among other therapies, kind of rose to the top because of equity-oriented considerations. There was no manufacturer involved for most of these cases. And so there was no complex negotiations around acquisition, pricing, supply. And I think we've had a lot of discussion about research agendas and what that looks like. And I'll highlight some of the studies we analyzed. Actually, the minutes of the meetings where these discussions were deliberated were public. And so I think one takeaway here is that when we think about agenda setting, and we've seen the involvement of industry sponsors across the last couple of days, is that this is inherently about the distribution of resources, who benefits, who is placed at risk. And we've seen the biases that result when there are interests, powerful interests at the table, commercial interests at the table. But even in removing those doesn't take away the fact that we have to have those conversations. And so with the convalescent plasma trials, with these different national contexts, we saw very different sets of values guiding study design and eventual outcomes. So in some cases, study designs, regulatory environments, the discussion was around prioritizing clear generation of evidence. So we saw these really large integrated into health systems adaptive trials in the UK. In the United States, there was very different values on the table, and they really prioritized access to this promising therapy. So a very large observational study was launched through an emergency access program. I think we could debate this, but both sets of values do appear to be legitimate, oriented toward public interest, but have critical implications for stewardship of resources and generation of meaningful results. But I think at the end, the takeaway is the need to think about clear, transparent, accountable processes for making these values explicit and ensuring representation of the communities who are actually involved and accountability, and that this be really explicitly guided by public interest. Another thing that I think stood out for us as qualitatively different among these trials was not only the public funding, but the reliance on public infrastructure. So there were a number of clinical trials networks that were already in place. REMAP, CAP, the Insight Network, they had been set up, they were running, the infrastructure was there for other diseases, other questions, and they could be rapidly pivoted. Even industry turned to the NIH for efficiency, which is not usually a word we hear associated with the public sector. What we saw, though, in the end, and these are the authors of the Placid trial in India, this quote from them was that reputed elite institutions, first world collaborations, third-party organizations, big funding are a big help if available, but they are not indispensable. And I think if we frame the problem as needing to replace the very large investment that industry has in clinical research, it does seem very much insurmountable. We will not find the political will. But I think it's also interesting to think about what research is actually needed, what is the priority, what resources are in place, and how can we leverage those most effectively. We also saw that public investment in these convalescent plasma trials, although it didn't end as a great story for convalescent plasma, it actually served to generate infrastructure and generate capacity within the countries that ran these trials. And that contrasts sharply, I think, where we see actually a great deal of public sector investment in research, in basic research, in research training, in capacity building, and then the public not realizing their fair share when those results and outcomes are commercialized and go do their thing in our current intellectual property regime. And so here we saw blood services set up, new plasma banks, new legislation around blood donation, and certainly a great deal of capacity building around clinical research. This is probably also a factor of the trials we chose, but the high profile prominent studies that we examined demonstrated a really high degree of openness. And I think this again contrasts to the status quo. Among networks of investigator trial protocols were shared very openly. Most of them had public-facing websites where we could access every kind of study document. They demonstrated a highly open science approach, which I think is also characteristic of pandemic conditions. Everything was released by preprint, but also press release, and also Twitter, which was critiqued at times for being science by press release. And at the same time, I think it really meant that these findings were rapidly disseminated into kind of clinical application, which I think can be a double-edged sword, but maybe a point for discussion. But like disclosure, we've had a lot of discussion around perhaps open data as a solution. I would say in this case, most of the studies said their data was available upon reasonable request, so perhaps not the degree of openness that we might require for a truly open science approach for reproducibility. But I think, again, the question here is open for who and open for what? You know, in releasing your results by Twitter or press release, is this a democratization of science, or is this a very public competition? When we put disclosures out in the world, we forgot to kind of ask what they were useful for, how they might be used, and by whom. And I think Dr. Saw has nicely developed a huge body of experimental research to suggest there may be harms with that. And so I would suggest this also needs to be coupled with robust governance and thinking, what is the openness for? So many of you in the United States may not have such positive feelings about convalescent plasma. It's certainly played out in a certain way in the United States. We've discussed a little bit, I think, the extent of influence of non-industry or public sponsors on health research. And I think this also is a very useful example in talking through what we mean here, because just because a study is publicly funded or publicly supported does not mean it is inherently politicized. And I would suggest these are different processes. Convalescent plasma became a high-profile promissory treatment. The story involves Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Dolly Parton and cruise ships and black markets. It's a very exciting study. Political decisions in India, in the United States, made convalescent plasma available outside of formal clinical trials, resulted in a surge in demand, and really created competition for trial participants. But again, the outcome of this set of studies looks very different than the status quo. All of these studies still published in high impact open access journals, despite convalescent plasma being not effective for their chosen outcomes. Treatment guidelines incorporated this evidence quite rapidly, and the change in practice happened despite the political pressures. And politicization happened very publicly in political public arenas, scientists vocally criticizing these policies, in contrast to kind of the behind the scenes suppression and critiques we've seen with the industry documents. So in conclusion, I think this story of the convalescent plasma studies shows us a different model. We can reimagine alternatives or pieces of it. These studies had the opportunity to fail. And I think this helps us reframe the purpose of health research and ultimately sponsorship. We don't need to think about these as positive or negative trials. We needed to answer a question in a timely way, an important question, and they were able to develop a definitive answer to this. I think this is another example of public sector innovation that's perhaps mission-oriented, prioritizing equity, affordability, access. And I would argue that stewardship of resources, equity, should be notions we further build into an idea of research integrity. I think we need to think of research then, particularly health research, in the context of health systems and public health capacity, and the role of public funding in relying on, but also building and generating these public goods. And to do that, to think about robust governance for various aspects of these processes. So I will just leave it there and gratefully acknowledge the work of my co-investigators on this project.